Hey there, history students. Here we are, getting ready to start this new adventure of our remote learning. So we're going to see how this goes. How I've done this is to make these into videos that can play through YouTube. All right, so my sons have taught me how to make a YouTube channel. Yay, here we go. And then I'll put these on there, and mostly that's for the ability to play the videos that we'll be watching during the lecture. I can't figure that out for Zoom and the recorded PowerPoint, so I'd like to play those. So that's why I'm going with this format. We'll see how it works. Furthermore, I'm a little nervous about going with the live classes. I don't know about y'all, if you've tried some already. I've been doing them with church, and at one point I got knocked off, and then I had to get let back on by the host or whoever, and so it makes me a little nervous that I might miss some of y'all on there like that. So I'm going to go this route and see how it works. And the biggest problem, I think, for this class, because it's lecture-based. I mean, obviously, you sit and listen to my lectures. That's going to be easy enough to do. The hard part is going to be getting your homework turned in, right? And I know a bunch of you said you were going to work on catching up over spring break and all that. So I'm expecting to have some stuff to grade. Yeah. So we're going to have to figure out how to get that turned into me. The Google Classroom is going to be useful in other classes because we can change quizzes to go on there and things like that. But for this homework, we really can't do it that way. All right, you've got your worksheets, and those just need to be handed in. And so we may look at some sort of scanning them. There's something called Genius Scan that you could. I guess it's like taking a picture and sending it to me. So we can try that. I can talk with your parents about, helping me out with that part of it, and we'll just have to go with the flow and see what happens here. But mostly I do want to get the content of the subjects we'll be covering to you. That's the most important thing to me, is you'll get to hear about all this amazing stuff that took place, leading us all the way up to almost to the present. We'll talk about current events, including this current event that is just unprecedented in history of really, certainly of our country and arguably of the whole world. I mean, there have been plagues and things like that before, but this is crazy, how we've just shut everything down. So it's a tough one. But we're going to roll with it. I believe God's got a plan here, and his plans are always good. He's going to grow us through this, okay? So I've already grown, learning how to use my computer a little better. And so y'all will too. Okay, so it will be a video. You'll be able to stop it if you want to. I don't know that you'll want to on the history one like this. You may want to, zip ahead or something like that. But anyway, you should be able to just watch, and you can pause it, to go off and watch half of it and then half later or something like that. All right. So I'm excited for this time of history that we're getting into. It's very exciting. 20th century is the American century, and so a lot of the history that happens is driven by our country anyway, by the USA anyway. And so we'll be looking at all, going through up to the wars and through the wars and all that stuff. So we're going to have fun with it. Okay, so just sit tight, watch, and enjoy. All right, and I hopefully we'll see you soon. I'm confident we'll get back to class at some point in time, mostly to deal with those projects that are coming up that I do still expect those to be done. Even if we don't get back together, I will expect projects. I'll get to that as I talk to you on your lecture. I'll go through the schedule and how it's going to work. Okay, gang. See you a little bit. Have fun.
All right, so here's our new schedule for middle school American history. You see we had our extra spring break right in there where I was doing my my tutoring on how to do all this. Week 26, which would be this week, is the 1920s. We'll get into that. And then comes all these other subjects down here. So I think what happens is right down here, it says we have 2 weeks smushed together here, but I really think it's right down here that I put the 60s and 70s together. And then this one down at the bottom, the 80s and 90s, is reasonably short. If we're back together in classroom by this time, then we could do this the same day as the project day. Since there's just a few of you, I think we can get through that just fine. All right, so if we don't get back together, then what we'll have is the project will probably be something, like a PowerPoint that you can send to me and I can watch, or we can Zoom the class that day and I can play your PowerPoints and you can explain them. Or if you prefer to do, I always want something like a model or something like that. So if you do a project like that, we can get pictures of those and put those up, and I can make a PowerPoint for that. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes. All right, so let's get started now. Uh-oh. On the 1920s. Okay, so the 1920s are known as the Roaring Twenties. Remember, the war has just ended, World War I, and that was a big blow. There was the big Spanish flu that killed way more than the war had killed. And so we're looking now at people who want to be uh, they want to live life to the fullest. I guess you could say it that way. We had just in our country started prohibition, which was the outlaw of all alcohol, and we're going to see some of the effects that had that during this time period. So in 1923, there was a very important invention that came out that we still have today. Here it is. All right. Yes, I would have had these for you today to snack on. And in fact, I went to the grocery store to pick some up just to have one. I thought I'd get a picture of me holding one or eating one. And wouldn't you know it, they were completely sold out. I guess apparently in times of crisis, chocolate is the answer. Yeah, and particularly the cheaper chocolates. So the fancy peanut butter cups, the ones I like, the organic ones, they had those. And so I was able to buy some of those, but I couldn't find any of these. If we're together by the end again, what I can do is I can bring a sample from each one of these weeks we missed. I'd be happy to do that. Okay, so this is our president at the time. He is president number 29. So Warren G. Harding was elected, and we can see him here. Do you remember this guy? This is William Howard Taft. He had been the president. Remember, he lost because Teddy Roosevelt ran against him, and the split vote between he and Roosevelt allowed Woodrow Wilson to win. But then Taft became the Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court. And so he was put in there, and right here he's with the new president, Warren G. Harding. And this man, you may not recognize him, that's actually Robert Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's surviving son, his only surviving son at this point. And what they are doing here, I believe it's 1922, and they've all gotten together to dedicate the memorial for Abraham Lincoln. We'll get to that at the end of the lecture. You'll see about the artist who prepared that structure. So speaking of the Supreme Court, we have William Howard Taft is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and there were some very influential people who were on at about this time. And in fact, their influence served to vault the Supreme Court into a role. It already was important as far as judicial review. Remember, that is the idea that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what is or is not constitutional, according to the laws that have been passed. And so in this particular case, we see the Supreme Court making a few more strides toward making law. In other words, they start legislating from the bench by giving some sort of moralizing, if you will, from the bench. So there's Taft. Here's his group of guys right over here. So you remember there are 9 justices. That is the constitutionally mandated is that we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And we're going to talk about a couple more under here. This is Louis Brandeis. So Louis Brandeis was the first Jewish American who had been put on the Supreme Court. And he was an activist judge. And so what that means is that he went about purposefully looking for legislation that could be passed and that the Supreme Court would allow, not necessarily because it was constitutional, but because in his mind, he thought it was right and good. Specifically, one of the things he really wanted to do was have America join in a effort called Zionism. Remember, he's Jewish American. Zionism is the idea that Israel should be made a country of its own and that the Jews should have a homeland again. It would take a long time. That eventually will happen, but it won't happen until after the next war, and we'll figure out that as we get to it. This is Oliver Wendell Holmes. He had been nominated and put in the court by Teddy Roosevelt. Also an activist judge. He was a moralist. How do I explain that? He believed that he knew how to keep America moral. And he believed that the court and the government had a role in keeping America moral. And so he came out with, he had all sorts of quips and quotes and things like this, that people began to think he was one of the wisest men in American politics. And so then the question is, are justices supposed to be involved in politics? He wasn't running for office or anything, but he was indeed influencing legislation that would come down. He also served for a very, very long time. He lived a long time. Okay, so Warren G. Harding wanted to go out and visit all of the states in America. He wanted to see the people face to face, and he went out on a train tour. So the train, remember, is connected from east to west now. He can go all over the place. And he went out for an extended trip. Here he is with his wife, and I'm not sure who that other guy is right there. I think some of his cabinet came along, but most of his cabinet, those are the guys working for him, stayed back in Washington, D.C. And while he was gone, yikes, one of the biggest scandals in presidential history took place. It is called the scandal of the Teapot Dome. So this is an area out in, I believe it's Wyoming, and you can see this, for apparently some people believe this looked like a teapot. And it's on what's known as a dome. And a dome would be a geological formation, and it's standing above what's beneath it, and what's beneath it is a bunch of oil. And this oil was owned by the federal government, because in this area of Wyoming, when it became a state, this part of the state was made into federal land. And so what's the big deal? Well, oil, of course, is a commodity that is very important. And apparently, this is one of the cartoons about it, right? So the elephant represents the Republican Party, and it's getting hot. Most of the blame falls down on this guy. His name is Albert Fall, and he was, I believe, the Secretary of State. And what he did, unbeknownst to the president, most of us believe, we believe that Harding had no idea about what was going on here. And remember, he wasn't even in town when the whole thing, came down. And so what we believe happened here was Albert Fall was selling the oil to different companies. And instead of, paying the federal government, he was pocketing some of the money himself and paying other people to keep it kind of quiet. So it was a genuine scandal. You can see here we have that teapot over here, and then this steamroller that's coming in and just going to run over everybody. And namely, it's going to run over the Republican Party. This is our vice president at the time, Calvin Coolidge. He had been chosen by Harding because he was a very calming, sober man. People liked him a lot. He was quiet. He was known as Silent Cal. We'll get to that in a minute. And kind of unassuming, where Harding was a big personality. He was considered by most people to be very handsome, and he went out and charmed the people. Well, where Harding charmed, Coolidge was just the quieter person. He did not do a lot of charming of anyone. Oftentimes I bring up a vice president for a specific reason, and that is because while on this train tour, President Harding died. We're not exactly sure what happened, but I'm showing you over here his beating heart. Most people believe that he had a heart attack, a massive heart attack, and died because of that. There are stories, there are conspiracy ideas out there. One of them that is even scandalous, something about how his wife may have given him a little poison. I don't know that that is true. It is just one of those stories, the idea that she was jealous of him flirting with all sorts of other women because he was such a big personality. We don't know. So the official story would be that he had a heart attack. Either way, he died in office, which we know what happens then. is that the vice president now will be vaulted into the presidency. So Calvin Coolidge was actually up in Vermont at the time. He was fishing when he got the news, and it was sort of actually late at night. Here's a picture of him being sworn in as president. And it turns out his father was a judge in the area, so he was actually sworn in to office by his father. And so this might be a good trivia question someday to say, which president was sworn in by a family member, and that would have been Calvin Coolidge. So now here he comes, president number 30, known as Silent Cal. He didn't have many words. He was what we call laconic, a man of few words. Here's a great anecdote right here. There was a lady at a state dinner who sat next to him and said, I made a bet today that I could get more than 2 words out of you. His answer, you lose. All right, so very few words. He is considered to be one of the heroes of conservative politics. He believed that the biggest problem in politics was too much politics. And he also believed that the less involved the federal government was, the better. And so this is the Coolidge era. Okay, so during this time, he actually will end up getting reelected as well because he was well liked, because guess what? The economy was going well. Anytime the economy's going well, the sitting president tends to get reelected because nobody wants to change what is good. All right, so let's watch a little video about Calvin Coolidge.
When Calvin Coolidge became president after the death of Warren G. Harding, there was one very important thing Coolidge had to do right away. He had to not beat Warren G. Harding. Congratulations! That means all of you can be as successful a president as Calvin Coolidge was. Hard-partying Harding had dragged the presidency into a lot of scandal. And then he unexpectedly died in office. People needed dignity restored to the White House, and they needed it fast. There was only one man for the job, Harding's vice president, Silent Cal. Yes, Coolidge was nicknamed Silent Cal. Story goes that at a dinner party, a famous writer told Coolidge she'd made a bet that she could get him to say
more than 2 words.
Coolidge's answer? You lose.
Often at a higher rate.
When Coolidge did talk, he said no-nonsense stuff that calmed people down, like, the chief business of the American people is business. Okay, it was no 7 years ago, but this is Calvin Coolidge we're talking about. The mid-1920s were considered pretty good times in America, money-wise, and a lot of people were having a lot of fun. The Roaring Twenties were perfectly happy to keep Silent Cal on board for a second term.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves.
Coolidge did follow in President Harding's footsteps in one way. He cut taxes on American businesses. Big business had been busy fighting with progressive presidents for years, so they were more than happy when Coolidge cuddled up to them. Coolidge didn't run again, but if he had, he might have had to take a little more action, because some tough times were on the way. But Silent Cal wouldn't be there to save the day.
All right. So during this time, during the Coolidge administration, we're going to look at a couple of things that were taking place. So remember, Prohibition was the constitutional amendment that had been passed that prohibited alcoholic consumption. Well, actually not consumption, production and sales. All right, so I guess you wouldn't be arrested if you were consuming it, but you couldn't make it or sell it. This had some serious unintended consequences. All right, so where people originally thought that Prohibition would bring about a moral uplifting of the country, it actually created some immoral things. So we're going to look first here. So this is just a little video of these ladies dancing. They would probably be known as flappers. So this was the Flapper Society. These young people where their young men had gone off to war in World War I. There had been all that death with the Spanish flu. And now they just wanted to have fun. You know, you never know when life's going to end, so they just wanted to have fun. So you can see these girls have the new hairdo with the bobbed hair. And then they're dancing probably what's known as the Charleston, that became very big at the time. And this is a speakeasy. So a speakeasy would be a bar. Now, as you can imagine, because of Prohibition, bars were not legal. They were outlawed. And so guess what happened? These speakeasies popped up. So a speakeasy refers to, there's a secret bar, typically, in a basement or something, hidden away. And when you come up to the door and knock on it, you speak really easily and give a password or something to be able to get let in. And then, of course, they were serving alcohol. So the alcohol was made in unusual ways because it wasn't legal to make it professionally. And there were people with stills in their backyards. Oftentimes, there were people out in the countryside because it was harder to find those people's stills. And then they would give it to men or people who would become organized crime. All right, so these guys would collect up the alcohol and bring it to these speakeasies and sell it. And they were involved in other crime too, gambling, among other things. So this right here, we're looking at what's known as organized crime, where groups of people would organize together and form a type of, well, it's actually the mob. All right, so mafia is apparently the Italian word for family, and families would get together and start this organized crime. So it happened to be in particular places that Italian families were running this. This man we're looking at right here is a famous mob boss. His name is Al Capone, also known as Scarface Al Capone. We'll get more into him in a minute. But the alcohol would be given to people known as bootleggers. So a bootlegger was somebody who transported alcohol from one place to another. The word comes from, if you hid it in your boot, and like a flask or something that got hidden in the boot. Well, obviously, this isn't in anybody's boot. This car was bringing in these bottles of alcohol that had been made in somebody's still. There was also people who made alcohol in a bathtub. It was known as bathtub gin. You can imagine some of this stuff would not have past health standards, so some of it could have even been considered poisonous. I mean, alcohol in general is a poison. It is a toxin. And some of this was really, really nasty stuff. But people were willing to give it a try. So Al Capone, he was a boss of a family crime unit, and he happened to be in Chicago. And so he was a tough guy, and he wanted to get a corner on the market of the alcohol sales and the gambling halls and things like this. And so one of the big things that these gangs did was they tried to compete with other gangs. So Al Capone wanted to be the top guy, the top gang, and so he went about doing that by getting rid of his competitors. A famous event that took place, it was on St. Valentine's Day in the 20s, where Al Capone's gang cornered another gang in a car garage. So they were in this car garage. When Al Capone's gang came in, they were dressed as police officers. And they told these guys to line up, you're under arrest, and put your hands up. And they did that. Now, what the picture you're looking at right here is a reenactment by the police department. So this isn't really happening right here. Nobody took pictures of that thing that happened. But the rival gang that were lined up against the wall over here, they thought they were being arrested. But then Al Capone's gang actually just ended up shooting them and massacring them right there. And then later, the cops came in to have a reenactment of what took place. And of course, Al Capone was a very wanted man. Everybody knew it was him. He wasn't the actual one doing the shooting. He had just ordered it. And so he was really, the police really wanted to get him arrested. But he kept his, there was no real evidence against him. So nobody could prove it in a court of law. Everybody knew it, but no one could prove it. And this man made it his life goal to get Al Capone arrested and off the streets of Chicago. His name is Elliot Ness. He's part of a group of guys that became known, these are law guys who became known as the Untouchables. There have been a couple of movies made about these people, one of them called The Untouchables. Here they are collecting contraband. In other words, they raided some of those speakeasies and were able to confiscate illegal alcohol and get rid of it. And they made a deal about it in the press. They showed everybody, we're getting rid of this, we're cleaning up the town, and eventually we're going to get that Al Capone. But he was slippery, and they had trouble getting proof against him until they finally got it. There he is in the middle. That's Al Capone. Okay, this is him with his lawyers, and he actually was convicted not of murder, not of organized crime, of selling alcohol or backing the gambling halls. Nope, he was arrested and put in jail for tax evasion. Elliot Ness was unhappy about the fact that he couldn't catch him on a bigger crime, but he was happy to have him off the streets. He did get put into jail, into, I think, one of the famous jails, either Sing Sing or Alcatraz, one of those. And so he was arrested for a time, but it did indeed put almost an end to his career in organized crime. But guess what? Somebody else just would come up and fill those roles. So organized crime in big cities like Chicago, New York, places like that continued throughout the 20s. So that is another unintended consequence of prohibition. So we have, all these young people who are seeking this illegal alcohol, and then we have this crime that pops up, and it became very serious crime. At the time, there was also a Red Scare. The Red Scare would be a fear of communism. So during World War I, the Russian the country of Russia, had to exit the war early. In 1917, they left because they had a revolution there. It was the Bolshevik Revolution, where communists took over Russia, and they actually had the royal family, the Romanov family, were all executed. That's the story of Anastasia. And the whole family there. When you take, or if you've already taken world history, you remember that story about the Romanovs. Very sad. But the communists took over the country. And so oftentimes the communists are referred to as Reds. That has to do with their flag. It's a red flag. And so in America, there was a big fear that the communists would try to take over here and there would be a revolution. That's one of the concepts of communism, is that we need revolution, and revolution will throw out the old government and bring in this wonderful new government. Well, it turns out, of course, communism isn't a wonderful new government. It is a very restrictive, no freedoms for the people type of government. And so we see there was this scare. There had been scares before, but this was a big one. People were very, very afraid that the communists were going to take over. You see some propaganda here to the left. Communism is the answer to all the world's problems. It will bring you heaven on earth and everybody will be happy. And that time has proven, history has proven that is not true at all. It doesn't work. So these guys right here were they got swept up into the Red Scare. They are immigrants, Italian immigrants with heavy Italian accents, and there was a lot of racial discrimination against people with accents. We call that a xenophobia. That means a fear of foreign people or foreign things. So there had been a robbery. In fact, I think we're going to watch a little video about this. There had been a robbery, and some money was stolen. And these two guys were arrested and charged with the murder. And because they were foreigners, nobody liked them. They thought certainly they're guilty, and so it was difficult for them to get their fair day in court. So let's watch a little video about it.
In the early 1920s, many Americans were terrified that communists would attempt to take over the country. Who were the communists? Why was there such a widespread fear of them? In 1917, Russia was taken over by a communist group known as the Bolsheviks. Communism is an economic system in which there is no private ownership of businesses or property. Because the average American takes great pride in the personal ownership of homes and businesses, communism was viewed as a threat to the American way of life. From the moment this revolution occurred in Russia, There were widespread fears that a similar type of communist uprising would occur in the United States. Some Americans felt that the recent influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, where communist and anarchist philosophies were prevalent, only increased the likelihood of such an event. In 1919, it appeared that many of these fears would be proven correct. A plot was uncovered in which 36 bombs were mailed out to important political figures, as well as prominent businessmen. U.S. Attorney General Alexander Palmer and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. were both targeted. John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were also threatened. On June 2, 1919, 8 more bombs exploded simultaneously in different cities across the country. Following these 2 incidents, the U.S. Justice Department launched a series of raids that came to be known as the Palmer Raids. This was an attempt to arrest and deport communists and anarchists who were seen as potentially dangerous. More than 500 foreign-born citizens were eventually deported. This panic over a communist threat became known as a Red Scare. The term is derived from a popular nickname, Reds, which was used to identify communists. Several other perceived threats also emerged in the 1920s. In April of 1920, 2 men were murdered during an armed robbery at a shoe factory in Braintree, Massachusetts. 2 anarchists were blamed for the crime. Nicholas Sacho and Bartolomeo Vanzetti both believed in a form of anarchism that promoted violent warfare against oppressive governments. They were placed on trial for the crime of murder and were eventually found guilty and sentenced to death. There was much controversy and doubt as to whether these 2 men actually committed the crime, but the frightened public was searching for a scapegoat to blame. Their sentences of execution were carried out in August of 1927. On the heels of this incident, a rumor began circulating that a major uprising would occur on May 1, 1920, but this never materialized. However, on September 1, 1920, a bomb exploded on Wall Street. 38 people lost their lives and more than 140 were injured. Communists and anarchists were immediately seen as potential suspects. Many were brought in and questioned, but ultimately no arrests were made. There was almost certainly a strong communist and anarchist presence in the United States in the late 19-teens and 1920s. However, it is largely believed that most of the fear over communist uprisings was the result of mass hysteria and paranoia.
All right, so mass hysteria and paranoia. We have a little experience now with that. I will say that recent history has gone back to look through the evidence of the Sacco and Vanzetti convictions, and I think what they've kind of concluded is that one of them actually was guilty and the other one probably wasn't. Can't remember which one's which, however. All right, but they were executed. All right, all this fear, this Red Scare and this kind of thing resulted in the reemergence of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Remember, this had started after the Civil War down in the South when the Confederate veterans were not allowed to vote. And so most of the voting was done by the recently freed African Americans. And so the Confederates were looking for a way to try to regain some power, and they harassed and terrified and sometimes, in some cases, killed some of those African Americans and some of the carpetbaggers who had come down. All right, so in the 1920s, when the KKK pops back up, it's quite different. It really wasn't about disenfranchisement, that means to lose the right to vote, or trying to get political power. It was completely about hatred and racism. And this was not limited to the South. There were plenty of these groups in the North. I know Detroit had a really large KKK group. And this is when we kind of get to the more, modern idea here of the burning of the cross, as you can see over there. And then to the right here, this is actually a movie poster of one of the first and actually very influential movies that was made. It was a silent movie, so it was made just before the 20s, like in 19 18 or 1919, something like that. The Birth of a Nation. It's still studied by film students today, not because of the content about the story, but because of the way that it was made. So there were lots of breakthroughs in the technology of filming movies and telling a story and this kind of thing. It was long. I know that Woodrow Wilson played it in the White House. He loved it. He thought it was a great movie, and he liked the content of it, which was talking about supremacy of whites over minorities. So, who did they hate? You see here it says we are loyal Klansmen. Notice they're still wearing hoods, so they're still hiding their identities. So who did they hate? Well, of course, African Americans. That might be number one on their list right there. But also, there were lots of other groups they hated. They hated foreigners. So this was part of that xenophobia that was going on. Anyone with an accent was targeted by these guys. They hated Catholics. They associated Catholics with immigrants as well, especially the ones from Ireland, you know, and this kind of thing, and that Catholics, they believed, were not real Christians. I don't agree, of course, with that. Jews. Once again, they thought Jews were conspiring to overthrow the government. They thought a lot of the Jews may have been communists, which brings up communists. They hated them, wanted to get rid of them, and they spoke out against these and oftentimes had some violent clashes with these different groups. We're not done yet. They also hated anarchists, like Sacco and Vanzetti. All right, is that everyone? Oh, no, they hated unions. Okay, so the unions would be the groups of people who banded together for the rights of workers in, namely, factories and things like this. The unions probably would have put into their ranks most of the people on the list behind this. So foreigners and Jews and Catholics and this kind of thing. And so they'd kind of group them all in that group. So they went about harassing and sometimes lynching and killing some of these people. This was responsible in the South for what is known as the Great Migration. So at this point in time, we have a lot of African Americans down in the South, and they're being told, you know, you're being oppressed down here. There are these Jim Crow laws, and up north they don't have these kind of things. Now, as we know, they did actually have some of these laws, and they did have KKK groups up in the north, but for the most part, it was more concentrated in the South. And so we have this a mass migration of a lot of African Americans who said, I want to go to where there's more opportunity. Down in the South, it's still very rural, a lot of agriculture jobs, things like this. Up in the North, very urban, with factories with lots of jobs to offer. And so there's this great migration that takes place. This man over here is Jacob Lawrence. He's an artist, and at the time he wanted to document this important event that was taking place. So we see over here, we see a large group of people. So this is part of his art right here. I think it's really great looking art. It's beautiful. I like the style, you know, very modern looking. And notice what they're doing. They're all getting on trains to go up north to Chicago, New York, and even to St. Louis to seek new opportunity. So there is a book out by Jacob Lawrence about that has all of the different scenes that he painted for this great migration. I like this one. This shows the rail, kind of the trains are going to be the salvation, taking the people away from the oppression in the South, and they're going to move up to different locations. And there's, I think, a series of 43 different paintings, all very interesting looking. So this is where they went, all right? And notice in Texas, a lot of them actually went out to California, Louisiana, a big migration up California and Seattle. And the ones that Jacob Lawrence was showing were these right here, the ones who were going up to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and then New York. Okay, so New York became a very big center of this great migration, bringing us to what is known as the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City. It's in the borough, one of the boroughs there. And a lot of the African Americans who migrated that way ended up in the Harlem area. And they started what is known as a Renaissance. Mostly it had to do with music. We had this great new genre of music that was being produced. Remember when we watched the video about during the slave times where the slaves were singing their hymns and they had that real great, kind of bluesy thing going on. They're going to translate that over here into the Harlem Renaissance, into what is known as jazz. Jazz is a uniquely American form of music, and it really had its genesis in the slave population and then took off here in the 1920s, which is known as the Jazz Age. They became very prolific and popular, not just with African American groups, but also with white audiences. And they played in different clubs. And one of the most famous of those clubs was the Cotton Club in New York City. And great musicians would show up. And let's watch a little video about it.
Throughout the 1920s, Harlem experienced a cultural and intellectual explosion that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Who was involved in the Harlem Renaissance? What was the ultimate impact? Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City which has a very large African American community. Harlem became a destination for African Americans throughout the early 1900s as part of the Great Migration. As more blacks made Harlem their home, it increasingly became well known as an African American cultural center. Poets, writers, artists, musicians, and philosophers were all key parts of the movement. One of the key components of the Harlem Renaissance was music. Jazz performers including Jelly Roll Morton, Fats Waller, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong perfected their music, which became very popular amongst white audiences. It was also during this era when the piano was incorporated into the jazz style of music. Traditionally, jazz bands had included primarily brass instruments. Intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey argued and debated issues of racism, ethnic pride, and other topics related to African American life. Poets such as Langston Hughes introduced a new form of poetry known as jazz poetry. African American literature of the era included themes such as how slavery had impacted the African American culture and how to combat stereotypes of Black Americans. African American clothing also drastically changed during the Harlem Renaissance. Black men started wearing zoot suits. These were suits which featured long coats with padded shoulders and wide lapels. Women wore low-slung dresses, silk stockings, and open-toed slippers. Both genders wore hats with wide brims. Leopard skin items also became popular, as they were seen as a connection to traditional African garb. The Harlem Renaissance had a profound impact on the United States, as well as the world. African American artists, musicians, and writers began to be respected on an international level. Not only were white audiences listening to and enjoying Black music, but white composers and musicians began incorporating African American rhythms and harmonies into their own pieces. The Harlem Renaissance also helped to change the world's perception of African Americans. Prior to the 1920s, blacks were thought of as uneducated farmers. However, thanks to the Harlem Renaissance, a new image of sophisticated and intellectual African Americans began to emerge.
All right, so this is one of the poets that was covered in that video. His name is Langston Hughes, and one of his famous quotes right here in his jazz poetry: "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or does it explode?" There was a play later that came along called A Raisin in the Sun, and it was talking about the experience of Black Americans at this time and then further after that as well. So we also have a very influential African American, George Washington Carver. This is one of my favorite guys. We talk about him in science. He was the one that was able to find all these applications for peanuts. You know, I guess he kind of invented peanut butter, but then he found the way for peanuts to be used for, face creams and lubricants for machines, and it was amazing. And so he kind of worked quietly behind the scenes, and he didn't make a big stink about anything. He just did his work and wanted to be respected for his work. He is absolutely respected in the science community today. At this time, there was a very famous trial going on called the Scopes Monkey Trial. It was a trial against this man right here. So this is a teacher named John Scopes, and he's a science teacher, in fact. And what he did was that he decided to teach evolution in one of his science classes. And the parents of the children in the class protested, and charges were brought against him, and for teaching, untrue things and this kind of thing. So there was a big trial that took place, and he hired one of the greatest lawyers in the country. His name is Clarence Darrow. And so Clarence Darrow was assigned to defend John Scopes. And then the other side, the prosecution side, was the state who were prosecuting him. And they brought in an expert witness, this guy right here. You probably don't recognize him, although you'll know him, because he is, as we've talked about so many times, the most famous American you've never known about. Okay, you remember who that was? That is William Jennings Bryan. Remember, he ran for office, for presidency 3 times. He lost 3 times. Also, we talked about The Wizard of Oz and how he was the cowardly lion figure in The Wizard of Oz. So there's famous interaction between these two when Clarence Darrow had him on the stand, and he asked him the question, when Adam and Eve left the garden and their son went off with his wife. All right, and they said, well, where did he get his wife? And so Jennings Bryan couldn't answer that question, and so that Clarence Darrow felt like he had stumped him, and that the Bible was just a fairy tale book and this kind of thing. There's a really great movie made about this called Inherit the Wind, if you ever get a chance to watch it. And speaking of science, lots of scientific advances are taking place at this time. We see a lab here, so some guys working on some stuff. Let's talk about a little specifics. Robert Goddard is considered the father of modern rocketry. A brilliant man. You can see he was like a mathematical genius to begin with. One of the dreams he had since he had been a boy was to build a rocket that could break through the gravitational pull of the Earth, to get beyond the gravity of the Earth. And furthermore, he thought eventually we could take rockets all the way up to the moon. All right, so that people thought he was crazy. They thought, you're nuts, we're never going to leave the Earth. Why would we want to leave the Earth? This kind of thing. But Robert Goddard persisted. He tried several different techniques. Here we see him with his rocket. The rocket is right down here. He's about to launch it up through this little fancy thing here. And he's going to send it up. This is not his rocket, but just a little schematic of a rocket. He came up with the concept of a solid fuel so that it would be a little more stable. A liquid fuel takes up a lot of space. You can't really compact it very well. It's, quite flammable, obviously, because it's a fuel. So this solid fuel was able to be compacted more into the rocket. So he did come up with a rocket that did break through the gravitational pull of the Earth. He did not make it to the moon. But his work, we built upon his work, so we eventually would make it to the moon. And speaking of flying, one of the most famous aviators at the time was this man, Charles Lindbergh. So remember, during World War I, airplanes were started off being used for surveillance, for going out and checking out where the enemy was. And then they started to realize it could be used as a weapon, right? They could put the guns on it and shoot from it and that kind of thing. And now they're looking at improving planes where they could be larger and still get off the ground. And this man right here, Charles Lindbergh, had a dream of flying a distance. He wanted to go across the Atlantic Ocean. Here he is with this famous airplane called the Spirit of St. Louis, and he's going to take this plane with him, obviously, over the ocean. This is what it looked like. Notice, I find this interesting, that he isn't looking out the front of the plane. He doesn't have a windshield because he had to have all this area taken up by gas tanks because he had to go a long way. So notice, to see out, he's looking up a periscope right here. So I find that interesting. His compass is behind him. He would be going on this trip alone. It would be solo because he had to concern himself with weight. So there was the weight of all the fuel. There was the weight of him and the stuff he had to carry with him. He had a little bit of food and water for him. And here he's going to go. I find it interesting. The engine's called the Wright engine. That must have been named after the Wright brothers. Here's his trip. He's going to leave New York, fly over land as much as possible, then get over the ocean and end up in Paris. So when he was over the ocean in this area right here, nobody knew where he was. And, you know, people had seen him in Newfoundland as he went by. And then everybody kind of held their breath until finally somebody saw him in Ireland and England. And then he landed in Paris to these great crowds of cheering people. He became one of the most famous people in the whole wide world, and certainly the most famous aviator. We have sports still continuing at the time, and probably what we call America's pastime right here, the most popular of the sports would have been baseball. You know, we should be having a baseball season right now. It should be starting, and it's getting put off until, I guess, the summertime. But here are some people. This is an ad for hats, and these people are watching a baseball game. Some of our most famous players started at this time. Arguably the most famous baseball player of all time is this guy. His name is Babe Ruth. An interesting guy. He was a big guy, you know, and he wasn't like a fast runner or anything, but he was powerful at the bat. And for the longest time, I think until the 1960s, he held the record for the most home runs that were hit. If you want to do a biography on him, he'd be a fun one to do. He had a great presence. He was very popular with the people, very fun, and he did hit lots and lots of home runs. And this guy's a pitcher, Ty Cobb, and he became famous for his fast pitch. And it looks like here he's stealing bases. Maybe he was famous for that as well. I know they have an award now named after him, the Ty Cobb Award, and I believe it goes to pitchers, if I'm not wrong about that. You may want to ask a baseball fan in your family. Football was also big. It was not as popular as baseball at the time, but it would become popular. This guy right here is known as Pop Warner. He was older, of course, and he had these young guys on a football team, and they played what is known as American football. And the Pop Warner leagues popped up, and they played each other. This is kind of the beginning or the very, very first hints of professional football that would take a little while longer to show up. Here's one of our famous early football players. His name is Knute Rockne. A movie later would be made about him called Knute Rockne All-American. He's a tough guy. Notice his helmet right here. This is back in the day when they were called leatherheads. That was the only protection they really had. And we can see over here Knute Rockne. He would give inspirational speeches for his guys to go out and play tough. It was a tough game. Similar, I think, to today's rugby. It was, you know, hitting and lots of really, really tough game. Jim Thorpe was, I think he did play football as well, but he was most famous as a track and field guy because he went to had previously been to the 1912 Olympics and had won a bunch of medals. He's got a great story. He is a Native American. He grew up on a Indian reservation and kind of overcame all of that to become this super famous athlete. And it seemed like every thing he tried, he did well in. So he did well in football and baseball and basketball, and he could do no wrong, really. His life was a little bit tragic in the sense that some people never really accepted him as a Native American, but he was able to make a living at professional sports. He had a couple of run-ins with, if you want to be an Olympian, at this time, if you wanted to be an Olympian, you couldn't have accepted any money for your sport. And it may have even been where he ended up losing some of his Olympic medals because of a conflict there of having accepted money. Bobby Jones set the standard for golf. In fact, he was basically the founder of the U.S. Open golf tournament, which is held every year, even to this day. And so he made a splash for golf. It became much more of not just a sport people like to play, but a sport people like to watch. It's not like watching a baseball or a football game. You have to follow this guy around and then just watch that little white ball try to go in that hole. So art and music of the time. Okay, we've already talked a little bit about the music with the Harlem Renaissance, and then we'll see some very interesting, also the art with Jacob Lawrence's art. This is Daniel Chester French. He is a sculptor, and he is responsible for building that, what we talked about at the very beginning there, was one of our greatest sculptures in our country. It's going to be the Lincoln Memorial. But he did other sculptures as well. This one is called the Minuteman. Notice the year he did this one. Okay, so he's been working for a little while now. But in 1876, what's significant about that date and the Minuteman? So this would have been a celebration of the 100th year of the American Revolution. There he is leaving his plow and going off to fight, ready in a minute, ready to go. But this is what was done in the 1920s. This is the Lincoln Memorial. So this is the building in which it's in. I'm not sure if any of you have had the opportunity to go see it. I've been there. It's beautiful. This big temple-like structure right here is housing a massive statue of Lincoln. So you can see him here staring out on his throne. His hands here on the symbol right here of the power of the federal government. That's known as a fasces, and how he had taken that power, right, and executed that as a president to take full power over the country. It's very, very big. If you've seen one of those Night at the Museum movies, right, it gets up and walks away. It's pretty cool. Here you can get a little perspective. People down here. So you can see how big it is. And up on the walls, back in these areas right here, are some of the famous quotes of Abraham Lincoln. You can actually walk behind it and see also up on the walls some quotes that are put up there. If you ever get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., this is a definite not to miss. So make sure and go see it. This is a female artist. Her name is Georgia O'Keeffe. She was working in the 1920s. Actually, her husband was a famous artist named Albert Stieglitz. He probably took this picture of her. And she ended up moving actually out to New Mexico or Arizona, one of those areas. She became very fascinated with the American West. And a lot of her paintings show that. You may actually recognize some of these. This one, notice just the flowing lines right here. I don't know if you can tell what it is. I think it might be a flower. She's famous for flowers. Look at this beautiful swirling, lots of color here. So notice we don't necessarily have a knowable subject. That's part of the modern art, right? The modern art's moving toward art for art's sake, not to necessarily show anything. The flower, though, is some of her most famous stuff. So these are giant paintings. And so this gigantic painting of a flower. I really like this one. It's a very, it's a building. So here we are in a city, right? So this is the building. Here's a street light, probably a red light, stoplight. There's the moon up there, a church back here. Very new age looking, right? I think it's cool. But the flowers, like I said, were her most famous. So these poppies, some of her most famous. Once again, massive, huge painting. Music, other than the Renaissance time, this is George Gershwin. This guy's brilliant. And in fact, he used some of the themes of the Harlem Renaissance. He really, really admired the Black American contribution to music. But he also had a dream of producing a symphony. And so he was one of our first American symphonic writers. We had other people come to America, like Dvorak and things like that, to write symphonies. But he's one of our, just American guys writing American music, also in symphony. We're going to listen to a little bit of it right here. Not all of it, just some of it. So I don't know if you recognize any of that, but it's called Rhapsody in Blue, and it actually is very brilliant. You may have heard it on some TV commercials or something like that. But George Gershwin was also famous for writing popular songs, and he and his brother Ira wrote a bunch of like show tunes for shows that were on Broadway and things like this. And this song right here is one of my favorites. I'm not necessarily fond of this rendition of it. This is a singer named Celine Dion, and she's singing a song called Summertime.
Summertime, and the living is easy. Fish are jumping, and the cotton is high. Your night is rich, and your mom is good looking. So hush, little baby, don't you cry. One of these mornings, you're gonna rise up singing. Then you'll spread your little wings and take the sky, take the sky. But until that morning, there's nothing that can harm me. With Daddy and Mommy standing by.
All right, so it's a great song. That great line, your daddy's rich and your mama's good looking. It's good stuff. So he and his brother wrote lots and lots of tunes. You would probably know some of them if you looked them up. Louis Armstrong, very famous trumpet player. I think we have a little tune from him here somewhere, right? He was just a great personality. He actually went on to be in some movies, and he was just a ton of fun. Oh, I thought I had a song by him. Bessie Smith, she actually is an African-American singer who made her splash she started in Paris and became very, very famous over there. She found less racism and things over there, apparently, and she's just very, very good. Our literature at the time. Probably the most famous of the 1920s writers would be F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm not sure if you're going to read any of him in your middle school literature. He is the most famous for writing The Great Gatsby, it's very, very good. It's showing kind of how the 1920s, the hope is kind of gone, really. And this jazz age wasn't really answering the questions for the people, and they were searching elsewhere. Ernest Hemingway, also writing in the 1920s. That's a little loop down here of him below, so you can see we're getting even to where the time of color is coming in. He's a journalist. He started off as a journalist and ended up writing several novels. The Old Man and the Sea, I think maybe might be one you were reading. Farewell to Arms. He had experience in World War I. He actually was a ambulance driver, and I believe this is the story that tells about that. Yeah, kind of, he wrote like a journalist, so somewhat not very flowery in his use of language. Harry Houdini was performing at the time, one of our great magicians. He was known mostly for his escape artist. You see him all in chains over there, and he would be all chained up, and they would drop him into a tank of water, and he would get himself out. So he was definitely good at that. He could move his joints out of place, this kind of thing, and he had hidden keys and stuff like that. Back to him for just a second. He's got the famous story about him is that he would allow anybody to punch him in the stomach, and he said, "Go ahead and give me a punch," and people could, he could hold his muscles real tight or whatever. And apparently the story goes that one day a man came up to him, punched him in the stomach, and Harry Houdini wasn't ready for it, and it caused a serious problem. We do know what happened to him was he had a burst appendix. Whether or not it had to do with this man punching him, or if that's just a mythological part of the story, what did happen was he had a burst appendix and it actually killed him. So he died from it. He and his wife, he was very much against these people doing seances. I think we talked about those before, trying to contact the dead and this kind of thing. And so he had told his wife that should he die, that he would do everything in his power to come back to talk to her. And he never did. So that was his final proof that there was no such thing as talking to the dead. All right, Hollywood at the time. Lots of movies being made down in California. It turns out, so this is the sign. You've probably remember the Hollywood sign. I don't know if you realized in the old days it actually said Hollywood Land. And then it all fell apart at one point, and because it's just made of wood, these giant letters made of wood up on the hills. But eventually they rebuilt it with just the Hollywood on there, and it's still there today. You can see it if you fly it over an airplane. You can see it. It's that big. This is the area of Hollywood. So it's in California, near Los Angeles, present-day Los Angeles. But at the time, look at it. It was just farmland. These were some of the haciendas from the old Spanish days and things like this. It turns out like they have vineyards and things, so grapes grow really well there. And a couple of people came down and said this would be a nice place to have a studio to film movies. And they started filming them. This is a silent movie actor named Rudolph Valentino, or Rudy Valentino. He was famous for silent movies, specifically The Sheik and The Son of the Sheik right here. You can see the movie poster for it. He became like the epitome of the kind of swarthy, handsome man. Very big star. His movies did really well. Interestingly, he also died of a burst appendix. So there was an appendix situation going on in the 20s, apparently. Harold Lloyd, watch this on the right. This is him doing a stunt. He's a comedian. And I will tell you, this was in one of his silent movies. This stunt is real. He really is hanging on the side of a building. I don't believe he has any harnesses. He did all of his own stunts. He was okay. He didn't end up getting injured from it. But he was always up for a laugh. And remember, these are silent movies. And his movies would have been comedies to try to get people just to laugh. Speaking of comedians, Buster Keaton. We've actually met him earlier when we talked about the movie called The General, where he stole the train during the Civil War. That was one of those silent movies. Here we see on the left over here, he's sitting on that train. I mean, he's just kind of a sad sack, right, with that sad face, wearing that pork pie hat. And there he goes off on the train. He actually stayed around Hollywood for a long time and made movies as an old man even when he was speaking. But he was most famous for his brilliant silent comedies. The most brilliant, of course, would be Charlie Chaplin. Here he is as the little tramp. And this is a clip from a movie where he's stuck in a cabin, I think, and it's cold. And I'm not sure if those are potatoes or rolls of bread, but he's making a little dance out of it. Okay, so he delighted audiences with his little tramp. He also went on to make talking movies later on. One of the most popular movies of 1927. This is called Wings. It's a clip from the movie Wings. The woman in the middle, her name is Clara Bow, known as the It Girl. And she has the bobbed hair, the 1920s, just the epitome of a flapper girl. And then these two men are going to be pilots in the Army, and they have some stunts they're going to show. I'll show you in the next slide here, a stunt that was filmed, and they put on, and this ended up winning the very first Academy Award for Best Picture. They had some pretty amazing stunts using airplane. They actually mounted the camera in the plane, which you can see right here. Okay, it is 27. Here he is shooting, right? So we have a take from outside the plane and a take from inside right here, the plane. So that's a new technique in Hollywood. All right, and that's why I guess it won. Now it's silent, completely silent. So if you're watching this movie, you would be watching this, maybe some music playing in the background, and every now and then some words would pop up on the screen to tell you what's going on. And then it happened in 1929. Al Jolson, who was a famous vaudevillian, remember the vaudeville was on the stage in New York and traveling around the country. He made a movie called The Jazz Singer. And he's going to be the one who's going to bring about the change, I guess you could say, into the sound movies, the talkies, where there would be a soundtrack that went along with the movie. There's a really, really funny movie that was made in the 50s called Singing in the Rain, which talks about this changeover from silent to talkies. And it's pretty funny, showing all the problems that they had. But I'm going to show you a clip now from The Jazz Singer, which changed everything in Hollywood forever.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Tootsie? All right, hold on. No, listen. Play Tootsie. 3 choruses, you understand? In the 3rd chorus, I whistle. I'll give it to him hard and heavy. Go right ahead. Tootsie, goodbye. Tootsie, don't cry. The little choo-choo train that takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Just be pretty and then out. Do it over again. Watch for the mail. I never fail. If you don't get a letter again, oh, I'm scared. Hey. Don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Kiss me, Tootsie, goodbye.
All right, so that, oops, sorry about that. That became just a really popular movie. I don't know if it looks like something you would like to see, but imagine this, the beginning of the movie, the whole story about this young man who was taking care of his mother and this kind of thing and wanted to go off and become a famous singer. It was all silent until the very end, when all of a sudden at this scene, you hear the music with him talking, and when he says, "You ain't heard nothing yet." That was the beginning of the sound in the movies. All right, so it became super, super popular. I think, okay, we're almost to the end here because we couldn't quite end it there because in 1928 there was an election. You can see that's a pretty red map there. And it turns out that it was a very popular guy called Herbert Hoover who was elected, remember, after Coolidge was finished there. Notice the electoral vote, wow, 83.5, wow. And then the popular vote, pretty good too, 58%. That's considered a landslide right there. So you can see the Democrat is still winning down here in the South for the most part. Interesting, Texas went Republican. These are the candidates. This is Herbert Hoover over here. He's going to end up winning. We'll talk a lot about him next week. And this is the guy he ran against. This is Al Smith. And many people believe that Al Smith lost so terribly because he was a Catholic. All right, so he was one of the first Catholics to run for president, and he did not win. In fact, I think to this day we've only had one Catholic who's become president, and we'll learn about him pretty soon. All right, so Herbert Hoover takes over. He was a brilliant man. He was an engineer. He had done a lot of work for President Wilson at the end of World War I to help with the European recovery and this kind of thing. The problem was he ended up not being a good president, sadly, and we'll learn about him next week. And that's because here he is, he's promising a chicken in every pot. He said we're going to be very prosperous. It's going to be a wonderful time because the 20s were fairly prosperous. But then something happened. Here he is, president number 31. In 1929 happened, okay? And there was what we call an over speculation of the stock market. and a stock market crash. All right, so right here it was way up high, and then boom, all the way down here like that. Notice it kept coming down and down and down and down and down. So this is the 1930s, which will be known as the Great Depression, and that is what we will talk about next time. It's interesting because we're looking at a economic time right now that is also very concerning. All right, so we're done here. Y'all just keep doing your homework, and I will see you soon. Okay, bye.